r/AskReddit. Non-US citizens of Reddit, what do your schools teach you about the United States? I went to school in Spain. In history class, the only US relate stuff we learned was the American Revolution, the Spanish-American War, WW1, WW2, and the Cold War. German here. In history class the US is really only mentioned in context of the World Wars or the Cold War, and even then the focus is on their involvements with Europe and Germany in particular. Apart from that, the discovery and maybe a footnote about the Revolutionary War, the US barely appears, though I didn't further pursue history in my high school years, so maybe more is taught there. In English class the civil rights movement and the American dream are popular themes to center debates around in high school, but overall there is a much greater focus on Great Britain and their former territories. We read some American literature, Of Mice and Men and To Kill a Mockingbird, but aside from that, America wasn't really mentioned in a particular class or anything. I'm in the UK. It was pretty much just Columbus and Martin Luther King. Chinese mainland are here. A lot. Though most of these were covered in very general terms. How much you needed to learn also depended on whether you choose arts and humanities or science for university entrance exam. My Chinese high school education stopped after 10th grade, so these are not all. But from my memories, we learned about Columbus discovery, Mayflower and Protestants, Boston Tea Party and the founding of US, American Civil War, and then the Great Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal. US is also mentioned, but not mainly discussed when learning about the colonialization of parts of China, especially their military involvement during the Boxer Revolution, and then the World War II, forming of United Nations, Korean Wars and briefly about Cold War. Also, we needed to learn about Nixon, because of the ping-pong diplomacy between him and Mao. In politics class we also needed to learn about the division of power in US Constitution. I didn't do history in 11 or 12, so really ground level shit. The US exists. Washington was this guy. They got independence from the UK. The Oregon Trail had all the dysentery. WW1, 2, and Vietnam happened. JFK was a dude. Armstrong went on a road trip for a few days. Those cowboy and Indian movies. Those Indians were probably not treated super well. It wasn't, realistically, until the internet and facts on demand that my history knowledge increased. Now I know it was Armstrong and Buzz and Collins on that road trip. From the game, of course. We barely learn about the US. That may be different for other schools, but I know jack shit about the US. About the revolution, MLK and how they fucked up in Vietnam. In India, all they taught me about USA was discovered in search of India by Christopher Columbus. That they invaded my country. Make a guess where I live. Here's my question: what do American schools teach about the history of other countries? Honestly, not a lot. The 1776 revolution is like an intro to our massive chapter about the French Revolution. And that's pretty much it. I mean, we learn about the World Wars and the Cold War, but we never learned about the Civil War and stuff. Almost nothing. We founded it. We left. You helped out in WW2 and MLK was a top bloke. That's about it. Canada here. War of 1812. The fact that Lincoln considered invasion after the Civil War. WWI and WWII. Cold War. In history class we were taught the following. I'm German BTW. Columbus discovering America and the first settlers' declaration of independence and Civil War happened sometime. Not many details. Just that it existed. WW2 and the Cold War. Although the focus was on Germany and how they supported the European economy with the Marshall Plan. Vietnam War happened. No details. It's just mentioned. In English class we talked about the electoral system, that apparently many people in the US are very religious and kind of prudish. IDK if that's true, that evolution and sex education isn't taught in schools and that homeschooling is allowed. Yes, we actually did discuss those topics in class. I think that's it. But we don't get taught more about other countries either. I live in France, and in history/geography class, which are taught by a single teacher, they mainly teach us about 3 things related to the USA: the big battles of the USA during WW2, Pearl Harbor, Midway, and June 6, 1944, Total War, etc. They also teach about the Americanization of the world, hard and soft power, globalization, etc. and the Cold War/Middle East era. And in English class we learn about more cultural and sometimes political stuff related either mostly on US or on England depending on the teacher. The problem is that the teachers are often from left political views and assume it's the obviously right way. Chilean here. There was a dictatorship in the 70s and 80s and the US financed a lot. The CIA was also involved in the torturing of people and killings. And of course covering the obvious human rights violation in my country. Maybe they don't teach that at American schools. Edit. Typo edit 2. This might came out as passive aggressive. But it was a genuine maybe, because I'm not American, and I really don't know if they teach it, haha. But according to most responses it's not taught in many places and a lot of people don't know about the US being involved in it. We covered the 20s and the US in history. That's it. They bought us from a 333-year colonization from Spain to give us freedom, but exploited us for another 100 or so years. Things like mountains, lakes, rivers, mineral resources, export and import goods, etc. We had to learn those basic data about almost all countries in the world. I'm Irish and here we are taught about the Civil War, their involvement in WW2, and how they accepted immigration, like during the Irish diaspora, and the civil rights movements as well as the Vietnam War. From Taiwan/Republic of China. Well, general geography and stuff sums up. History about revolution and purchases here and there. Numerous war mentioned in a paragraph or 2 from US Civil War to Gulf War. Also stuff about how we are the allies in WW2. They aid us in the 1950s and 1960s. Oh. And cutting diplomatic ties with us. Thanks Nixon/Carter. Nothing that I remember here in Romania. All I remember is them glossing over Civil War. Talking about how your slaves fled to Canada. Every year we learned about the Underground Railroad. Like we were heroes or SNTH. And how we took the White House and essentially beat your during the War of 1812. Mind you, they essentially glossed over anything horrible Canada ever did, so like propaganda much. In elementary school they taught us that there is no typical American in terms of looks. With that I mean that an American can be white, brown, black, etc. Also that it's a melting pot with many different cultures. So we kids had the image of the US as being diverse and also respectful and tolerant towards all different skin-colored people. In Brazil we commonly study what led the US to become independent, but not the war itself. WW1, WW2, the 29 crisis and what you guys did and do in Middle East. I'm Australian. Never taught anything American related. They just bring up the school shootings anytime we try and complain about shit. I went to an American international school and took world history for freshman and sophomore year. But I did not choose American history in junior or senior year. We watched Saving Private Ryan and The Hunt for the Red October. That's all I remember. Later on I read about all the stuff the CIA did in Latin America and a podcast on Chiquita. As a Latino, that made my blood boil and totally changed my perception of the United States, corporations, and the CIA. Here in Brazil they teach about the American Revolution and a little bit about the independence process, but the topic that they teach in most details is the Cold War, mostly because the US basically imposing dictatorships all over Latin America after Cuba, including Brazil. Not much at all. I'm in England and we aren't taught much at all about the US. What we were taught was in GCSE about the colonization and the removal and murders of Native Americans, however it was very brief. I think Americans tend to forget that the history of the USA itself is so brief compared to most of the rest of the world that we don't really care. They teach us a lot about the political side of things. and how the system needs improvement, as well as a little bit about the economy and the global trade. Most of the negative stuff I hear about the US comes from the news. From Australia BTW. Mainly about our common fight about Adolf. In Ireland we learned about the war independence, WW2 and the Cold War. The only two times that the United States appeared in our school books was the chapters we had on World War I and World War II and its aftermath in history. We were taught about why the US entered into the war, and that it emerged as the strongest political and financial power after each of the wars. It's sad, IDK actually, to say that most school history is just about the country and a little bit about neighbors, mentioned if something directly affecting us happened like war or treaty. On one hand, the land does indeed have a very rich history spanning millennia. On the other hand, it'd be cool to know about kinda recent history of the currently prominent countries. Major global events are mentioned, and sometimes discussed briefly, though Iraq Readdit. That's a long answer which can be summarized to pretty much nothing. A fake. England we learnt about America's role in WW2. We learnt about the Prohibition and immigration melting pot. We learnt about discovering America and some things that happened from then until about the 1920s. So basically not as in detail as US schools. Americans. What did you learn about England in school? Basically all we hear about the US in school is how much they go to war everywhere, and that their only loss was Vietnam, where they were being absolutely brutal to innocent people. Nothing much. We get basic info about the US becoming independent, and aside from really important events, like the Great Depression, we don't know much about the US. Greetings from Croatia. Also we know Coca-Cola uses slave to produce that delicious carbonated and sugary fluid. Australian here. We use American material in our learning, e.g., read American literature, look at a few case studies from the US in geography, use US textbooks. We don't really learn anything about the US though. In history America is mentioned for passing in WW1, WW2, and the Cold War, but certainly in core history the focus is on Australia's part in those wars. I didn't take elective history, but I know they look at America more in that. In history and English we look at the civil rights movements, and in English we look at themes such as the American dream and stuff, but not much more than that. Also in geography we debate about issues relevant to US politics, namely a certain president, as much as we discuss our own politics. But that's just because my class likes debating, not because it's part of the curriculum or anything. Nothing, like literally nothing. Here in India, we learn about other countries only in high school. In history, almost nothing. In geography, they usually teach about the fault lines and mountains longing through the west coast. In year 7 or 8 we talked about national parks and some of the presidents. We made presentations for both topics. In year 12 the overall topic of our English lessons was African American history in the US and the Civil War. Very interesting tbh. In my economics and politics class we sometimes talked about US politics. We will probably do that again in November. Edit. Also their involvement in colonialism and WW1 and 2. We used to own it, but you hats couldn't enjoy drinking tea or our finely tailored redcoats. This is why you don't have your own series of Doctor Who. Nothing. That us jobs pay better than the jobs in my country. Mexican here, America bad. Took Texas and petroleum. America likes war. Pancho Villa was amazing. He was a rapist a-hole, so basically shitting on everything that wasn't Mexico. NGL they did take Texas, but let's not forget Mexico's leaders are mostly historically stupid money-hungry bastards that care 0% about others, and 100% about themselves and their families. Not much, but the United States is pretty good at teaching everyone about the United States simply by being the United States, and by doing United Statusy things. I grew up in South America, so I learned about the British, Spaniards, Dutch, and Portuguese slave masters. The only thing I learned that was related to the United States was the fact that the indigenous people suffered a similar fate as the South American natives when the European settlers stole their lands. Canadian here. A course option at my high school was American history. Curriculum was from the Mayflower up to around Nam, with larger units focusing on the Civil War, Henry Ford, World Wars, and the Civil Rights Movement, all of which was postponed. However, a few days into the 2001-2002 school year, I teach primary, elementary, so we don't do a unit on individual countries, unless it's in geography and students choose a particular country for a project. I'd assume that student knowledge of the US is pretty basic. Most could probably name the capital, and a few key facts. They all know Donald Trump. They all mock Donald Trump. That we colonized it. Extremely racist history and present. Believes they are the land of the free yet commit horrific human rights violations worldwide. Like a really bad friend from high school who used to help people out but now has gotten heavily into drugs and crime. Australia. As a Brazilian citizen, they teach us to not call the US as America, because America is a continent and not a country. Philippines here. This was 15 years ago, so IDK if they still teach the same. We learn things about the US, mostly about the Spanish-American War, which we were part in being as we were a Spanish colony that the US took over. This led to Philippine-American War which the US won and took us as a colony. Then we were slowly being given autonomy to independence but Japan invaded. US became our savior and an ally and ever since then America is regarded as our big friend across the ocean that is ready to defend us against our Asian neighbors and communism. Hollywood action movies and products, Coca-Cola/McDonald's, further reinforced the idea that America is the dream and protector for the poor to escape poverty. America isn't as focused on in other countries as Americans would think. Not much, but our teachers make fun of Trump etc. Purified Japan by the atoms. UK here and I took history GCSE, end of school exams. We learned about the Great Depression, the Cold War and the Korean War. Honestly the most boring bits of history to me. Pre-GCSE we barely touched on the US apart from the small part they played in WW2. The history, geography, economy, and politics. Columbus and his ship, what your capital is, and why there's 50 stars and 13 stripes on your flag, and that most Americans sadly think that our country, Switzerland, is the same as Sweden. Oh, and that you have some hunger for oil now and then. For me you guys are all level evil. Elvis, Hollywood, long roads, New York skyscrapers, Rocky Mountains, freedom, semi-trucks, muscle cars with brabbling V8s and cheeseburgers. Only the bit of the Civil War that interested our country. Boston Tea Party maybe. Also FC we learned their general role and alliance in WW1 and 2. But except Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's pretty general to the role of the alliances. German here. In regular history class, we just learned about America's role in the 2 world wars. America was a bigger topic in my English class though. We talked about the American dream, culture and diversity, then and now, the first settlers and the likes. I'm 13 so there's definitely going to be more to learn in school, but so far, all we have discussed is the civil rights movement in the USA. The Boston Tea Party. I'm an Australian 12th grade student studying history. My syllabus was largely US centric. My first topic was the US from the period of 1941, and that included everything from social macup, economics, culture, the Great Depression, and then the FDR years. Second topic was the Indochinese conflict. That was really a brief summary of protests and different approaches adopted under all the presidents at the time. Last topic was US civil rights. Ironically, I know more on US history than I do about my own country. I love studying it though, and really allows me to view the country through a different lens. Not much. Think the US was mentioned in the context of WW2 and Vietnam War. That's about it I think. In school we learned about Native American culture when I was about 9 to 10. Then we later learned about how America was colonized and the American Civil War. I later read about the Vietnam War by borrowing books from an American friend. I'm from the UK and grew up in HK going to an English school, just FYI. Anything else was learned via the BBC News and reading Time and Newsweek. We covered the world wars but focused a lot on the Holocaust. They tell us that our constitution was copied from the US Constitution, which is true for most South America, and that's why we continue to exist. Us is the free beacon in the world. In France, I learned how Americans participated in WW2 and how they won space race. Oh, and for that later part, there was a moron saying no, it's salad conspiracy, the whole year. Nothing much really. Only some WW2 stuff, and since I'm from Portugal, a little bit about America's discovery. For literature we read our own country's books,